Welcome back, everyone. We are so fortunate to have our next speaker, Dr. Eric Sid, who will be talking to us about the importance of natural history studies in rare disease. Dr. Sid is the program officer in the Office of Rare Disease Research at the National Institute of Health, where he's the lead for the Genetic and Rare Disease Information Center. Dr. Sid is also the lead for the Rare Diseases Registry program, which offers guidance for establishing and maintaining patient registries and oversees the NCATS toolkit for patient-focused therapy development. Dr. Sid received his MD and Master's of Health Administration degrees from the University of Washington School of Medicine and School of Public Health, respectively. Welcome, Dr. Sid.
Thank you, Meg, for that introduction. So again, my name is Eric Sid. I'm a program officer with the NIH in the Office of Rare Diseases Research, and I'm here today to talk to you about the importance of natural history studies in rare diseases. A little bit of background behind the office that I belong to and the work we do. Our mission is to accelerate rare diseases research to benefit patients. And how we do this is by facilitating coordination between multiple different stakeholders in the rare diseases community. So scientists, clinicians, but also patients and patient groups, like many of you that are watching this today. To start us off, what exactly is a rare disease? In the US, this is defined by the Rare Disease Act of 2002, which defined a disease as rare if it affects less than 200,000 people in the US. Now, this is a regulatory definition, and what that means is that you will have different definitions across different countries with different regulatory agencies. So again, the US has this definition, less than 200,000 people affected in the US, and that translates to, when you're talking about something like prevalence, a disease that affects less than 6 in 10,000 people. In the European Union, this is less than 5 in 10,000, Australia, less than 1 in 10,000, and in South Korea, less than 4 in 10,000. Now, there are differences across these different countries because, again, these are all regulatory decisions made by each individual country. But what keeps these all of these different definitions as succinct is the fact that the problem that rare diseases are trying to face and using that definition is a problem of how to bring attention to diseases that perhaps may have trouble bringing in researchers or business interests from pharmaceutical industries, as well as a lot of other common problems that you'll see. So how many rare diseases are there? Using this US-based definition, again, less than 200,000 people in the US, we have about the estimate of around 6,000 to 7,000 diseases. Of those, many of them affect the nervous system, so about 45% as a whole. But if you focus just on, for example, pediatric diseases, just almost 90% have some type of nervous system symptom that you might see as a result. So why exactly does it matter if a disease is rare? I was alluding to this earlier. Well, of those 6,000 to 7,000 different diseases, which collectively are estimated to affect almost 10% of the US, so that'd be roughly around 30 million people, only 5% of these rare diseases actually have an approved treatment. Now, why is that? Well, this graph right here, and then please try not to get lost in details. This is just to kind of show you some of the reasons why that can be so difficult. When we go about the process of doing research and development, or R&D, you may start with numerous different drugs that we're thinking may end up being usable, but as you go through the process of research and starting to test out those drugs, for example, in cell lines or animal models, and then eventually bringing them to human trials, over time, this can take almost 10 to 15 years, cost billions of dollars, and sometimes this won't go and lead to a therapy being approved at the end. There might be a lot of back and forth. This is non-linear. So the hope is you go through this entire process and you end up here. And again, if you think about that for many rare diseases, the problem here is if you only have a disease that's affecting this very small set of the population, say even 10 or 20 people in the country, let alone in the world, this can be difficult for many, both researchers as well as companies, to want to go down this process for approval. So when we think about this, this is really a translational science problem. And this is why, again, our Office of Rare Diseases Research is actually located in our Center for Translational Science. So if we think about those 5% of rare diseases that have an approved therapy, even then, there are all sorts of issues. So what we try to do at our center and what we try to do in our office is look at this and say, well, can we think about all the different layers of both, for those diseases that have a treatment, how do you eventually get them to the clinic? But for those that don't, how do we start this process? Do we go from, again, looking in under cells to then perhaps trying to test within animals and then eventually humans, but also bringing that again to the clinics and ultimately to actual patients and making sure that we're having an actual impact on the population. This is important, and also, especially in this conference, I think is really important that you're coming in this as well as those of you that are patients and patient group leaders, that patient involvement is central to all of this. So what that means for us at NCATS is we try to think about within rare diseases research, can we find common generalizable platform solutions that can apply across many different rare diseases? So I alluded to this earlier again, patients with rare disease oftentimes will face common barriers. Lack of treatments obviously is one, but even the diagnostic odyssey is another. Many rare disease patients report between 6 to 8 years on average in terms of from the start of their symptoms to getting a diagnosis. So even understanding if you have the disease or not is a big issue for a lot of folks. And then there's the need for more clinical experts or specialists in your disease. But in addition to that, there are a lot of the research challenges that are also common amongst many rare diseases. Research on a rare disease as a whole can have faced multiple collective obstacles. The most important one, and the one I'm going to focus on today, is our limited understanding for many of those 7,000 diseases and the need for more research data, in particular natural history, on a disease. So again, I want to focus on thinking about this from the angle of therapies, and I'm going to come back to natural history in a moment because in many ways, natural history and therapy go hand in hand, and I'll explain what I mean by natural history in a moment. How do we bring a therapy to a rare disease? Again, I showed you that crazy chart with the amount of time it took and how much money. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that there really is a no one-size-fits-all approach to this. Some rare diseases, again, can affect thousands, others have less than a dozen. The best approaches really are a balance of understanding your organization's resources, your community's needs, as well as your disease's scientific understanding. And this chart here on the right-hand side, this graph, what it's showing is just, again, the fact that a lot of different diseases on this axis here, you're seeing the percentage of rare diseases that affect very small population sizes, less than 1 out of a million. So at the most, this would be maybe 300 patients in the US, but many of these are probably, again, leaning on the low end. So you can expect for everybody that is, for groups that are in this area here, how that would compare to groups that may be on the other side where maybe there is still closer to 200,000 patients. It's a very different issue that they may be addressing. So that's why it's really important to understand all of these elements. And we're going to focus our discussion today really on this disease scientific understanding aspect. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you want to translate scientific discoveries into patient care, again, as some background to this, we first have to think about the research infrastructure. So I've mentioned this before, basic research, what happens within cell lines or under a microscope in a petri dish, preclinical research, where we're starting to study, for example, with a drug, maybe the impact on an animal model like a mouse. Then we have to bring that into humans and we have to do clinical trials. And then following that, again, is bringing that to the actual clinics, making sure that they're being brought to hospitals, and then making sure that the public as a whole is able to access and utilize these therapies. Now, for clinicians, what we do from translating this research into understanding of a disease, oftentimes we'll talk about things like etiology, physiology, pathology, and ultimately, again, therapy and guidelines. For a patient, what you're seeing is really, what's the cause of my disease? Is there a gene behind it? What are the symptoms? Is there a diagnostic process? So if I want to be diagnosed, again, is there a test for me or a lab? Is there something that my doctor can check off and say, hey, you definitely have this? And then again, if we actually have a therapy developed, how do I gain access to that? And how is that ultimately affecting my quality of life? What we have to do in research often is we have to move a disease and our understanding of a disease from observation, where we just have information or data about, again, what causes it, what symptoms there are, and ultimately the diagnosis of it, to intervention, again, access to that therapy, and ultimately, hopefully, impact on quality of life. Now, the result of research is really data. The product of any scientific research is data. And again, that is central really to understanding how research progresses from stage to stage and ultimately leads to therapy development. So what is what data is needed for therapy research and development? Well, again, if you kind of focus on this as your end goal, trying to develop a drug, for example, we have to think about this from this framework. There has to be regulatory approval decisions, there has to be clinical trials, you have to also identify therapy, but all of this is backed on a lot of other data to help inform these decisions. So if you think about it as a house, before we can get to the roof, we have to build a solid foundation. And some of this will be information or data about patient experiences, preferences, quality of life, clinical types of data, biomarkers, outcomes assessments. But to even get further down into that foundation is natural history studies or natural history data. So what exactly do I mean by natural history? What is a natural history? Well, a natural history study is a clinical trial or a research study that tracks the course of a disease over time and identifies the demographic, so for example, differences across ages, populations, genetic, environmental, and other variables that may correlate or tie with or associate with disease progression and patient outcomes. So what that means is a natural history study is really looking at the natural history of disease and trying to understand what's our expected course of a disease over time. So this can include looking at what happens before symptoms even develop. Does it occur in certain populations, for example, age groups, in certain locations? Are there certain risk factors or exposures, maybe a particular pollutant or a certain type of, exposure that might lead to this? And then ultimately, what happens on onset of symptoms? How does that look? And as you then have the disease, is it static? Does it change over time, or does it stay the same? And if it does change, what does that look like? Does it progress? So this is really what we're trying to understand when we talk about natural history. And in some ways, to make it a little bit easier to understand, I always think of it as from the framework of, as a patient, if you're going to talk to a doctor, the questions you have are really about what's my diagnosis or what caused my symptoms, what are my treatment options or side effects, and what do I do next? Again, all of this, when we try to ultimately dial this back to understanding as a physician how to answer a patient's questions, it's going back to how we define the natural history of a disease and ultimately what we can get from these natural history studies. So again, if you think about from that framework, then a natural history study helps us understand the disease from a scientific basis by looking at, again, risk factors that lead to that disease progressing or any of the changes over time of the clinical course and progression and the symptoms that may have, as well as, again, environmental, population, and other factors that lead to having the disease. And I think the importance here is that natural history studies, now that you know a little bit about what we're looking for and why we have to ask them, they oftentimes are fundamental in facilitating therapy development. So if you think about therapy development, the needs here are, and again, what natural history studies help do is they help inform how we design our clinical trials. So for example, even just knowing what is the size of the population that's affected by this disease? They help us define biomarkers, or for example, again, if we talk about what type of labs you might have to order, a common one that you may have heard of is something like, for example, blood pressure, and used in terms of discovering whether or not you have hypertension or high blood pressure. But with a biomarker, what that is sometimes is a lab. So for example, in diabetes, we oftentimes will use blood glucose levels, your sugar amounts inside your blood. Another biomarker you may have heard of before is an A1C. So that's part of the question first, is how do we start, now that we have a general idea of how big the population is, how do we know who has the disease and who doesn't? Or how do we know if a disease at a particular stage or not for one patient versus another? So some diseases, again, may change over time. Can we use some type of lab measure in your blood, your saliva, in your other types of fluids or tissues that we can help us identify within that population, again, stages of clinical progression? Ultimately, this helps us then develop clinical outcome measures. So for example, when we want to actually understand whether or not a drug is having an impact on somebody, we need something to record that against. So if a drug is important because we want to say this is going to help, for example, bring the ability for you to be more mobile and walk across, a hall, we oftentimes will use terms like a 5-minute walk test or other types of assessments that help us see if we give someone this drug, what happens. So you can think about it in the sense of, I always like to think about things from the angle of cooking, just because that's an easier way for me to explain things. If you're trying to say one recipe is better than another, you need to be able to compare things, right? You need to be able to say, okay, how much time did I put it in the oven? What's the taste that I'm determining one recipe is better than the other? Is it salt? Is it the amount of acid? Is it the sugar? Ultimately, at the end of the day, again, this is about trying to improve quality of, for example, with cooking, the taste of a recipe. But with therapies, again, we need to make sure that whatever we're developing actually has an impact on and benefit for a patient that outweighs perhaps any risks that may come with that in terms of side effects. So this all goes together with a natural history to ultimately give us some sense of historical control, or what's the natural expected course of a disease, and what data can we draw from that to say, hey, with this clinical trial, this new drug, there is actual difference we're seeing here compared to what would normally occur without this drug. So this next slide's a little bit confusing to see, and I just wanted to show this to you more to call attention to. This is how complex therapy development is. Everything, again, I mentioned earlier, basic research. Don't worry about actually focusing on the details here. What I wanted to call your attention to were these two little circles here. And this is where natural histories fit in this entire pipeline process of developing a drug. And what you'll notice is, if you call attention to this area right here, understanding patient need is really one of the main driving points of both natural histories, as well as understanding clinical and therapeutic endpoints, or again, outcomes that we can track and check to see whether or not a drug does anything. So they're very central to this process. So, okay, I now hopefully you have a little bit of a basis for what I'm meaning by the importance of natural history. Well, how do I get started on this now? So many groups oftentimes will start with a patient registry. A patient registry is an organized system to collect uniform information with a defined purpose, a target population, and a method. And this is a definition coming from our colleagues at the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research, or HRQ. When we refer to the term uniform information, this is data. And a lot of the times we're talking about is just who's both collecting the data. Is it the patient or the participant that's providing the information? Again, it could be the patient himself or even a caregiver. Is it a clinician or a researcher that's actually writing this all down and recording this, and asking questions or taking temperatures and performing other tests? And what types of information are they asking about? So oftentimes, a lot of folks will think about a patient registry starting first with contact information or a contact registry, because they just really want to know, again, how many people are affected by the disease potentially, and where are they? Where do they live? How do we gain access to them? Maybe some information about their demographics. What age are they? What's their background? When did they start having perhaps symptoms? Have they actually seen a physician and received a certain test? Do they have a confirmed diagnosis? And then ultimately, as you're moving down the chain of different types of data you might be collecting, you might then move into more medical data. And oftentimes, the importance here is making sure you're collecting the right type of medical information. So oftentimes with research, we want to make sure that it's collected in a very, again, uniform way. So if you ask someone, what is a cough, or do they have a cough, or what type of pain are they having, that is something that a lot of folks can interpret and respond to in so many different ways. So really, the difficulty here is trying to collect all this information in a manner that, again, ultimately is usable. And I think the key with registries are that registries really help us translate individual stories into data. So again, data is what drives research forward. And the essential questions here are really, how do you collect it? Where do you store it? What do you need to gather? But going back to my analogy earlier about thinking about pain, if I ask you about a headache, a lot of the times folks, for example, when I've talked to patients in the past about headaches, they will think up of both headache from pain, centralizing right here, but also they'll mention things like dizziness or lightheadedness. So a lot of times, again, the question and the types of research information you're trying to drive from that story must really tie into some best practices, so that you make sure you get the right type of data from your questions, from your registry. So that's a little bit, again, some background on registries. Well, how do I actually do this? Now, where do I go from here? How do I get started? So at NIH, we do have a couple of different resources that our office has helped to start. One of them is called the Toolkit for Patient-Focused Therapy Development, and that's accessible at toolkit.ncats.nih.gov. And another one's called RADAR, the Rare Disease Registry Program. So that's found at registries.ncats.nih.gov. These are training and resource repositories that basically are websites to help educate and prepare patient advocacy groups like many of the folks that I'm hoping are attending this conference on how to actively take a role in supporting research in your disease. And they're a collection of both some best practice, some templates, but also some general information just to understand the lay of the land and some of these, again, these definitions I've started to introduce there. And the thing I want to really kind of note is this isn't something that, we are trying to do and say that, here's the route that you need to go about both in starting the process of perhaps thinking about how your organization may start developing a natural history study or may start creating a registry to support that. What we're trying to do is ultimately connect you with resources that are already out there. So for example, this is a research process for patient advocacy groups that is coming from one of the groups that we've kind of pointed to as a best practice in this from an organization called Global Genes, which many of you may be aware of. And they've kind of gone through and they've actually looked at a lot of the different resources that are out there as well. So rather than try to reinvent the wheel here, we're trying to put into these websites, again, some general information, but also some pointers to where to find more. So if you go to those websites, what you'll see is hopefully, we're still working on this, and so these are both still in development, but some user-friendly websites that really focus on plain language information, and again, highlighting some reliable resources. And again, for many of you, this may be the starting point. I wanted to make sure that I left enough time for Q&A so that I can actually go into any particular focuses that many of you have, because I want to make sure that whatever I'm able to describe about your journey into hopefully helping collect natural history study, or even starting with developing your contact registry just to understand what your community looks like and how many people are affected with the disease, that I can get a better understanding of what you're going to need. So I'm going to leave these different resources up here as well as my contact information, but I'm going to try to spend some more time now with some questions and answers just to help tailor what I can in terms of this presentation to those of you that have questions right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much for all of the information, Dr. Sid. This is really helpful. We have some questions already coming in through chat. And just as a reminder, if you want to raise your hand virtually, we can call on you and you'll be able to speak your question. The first one is coming from Miriam, and she's asking, what are the key indicators or factors that would indicate that a natural history study is complete? So when is it really done? Because it could go on forever.
Yeah, and part of the question here has also to do with how you're looking at things from a research perspective. For example, oftentimes when we're talking about natural history, we're talking about natural history in the context of not so it's not in the context of not receiving any treatment at all. A lot of the times when we say, so for example, there's only 5% of rare diseases that have an approved treatment, that's a specific targeted treatment just for that disease. So for example, in the analogy I was using with diabetes, that would be insulin. In many rare diseases, there are still clinical therapies for them, clinical treatments to manage their symptoms. So, for example, if there's particular, issues, I was mentioning a lot around headache, there's a lot of treatments to help manage pain. That's different than talking about a treatment specifically to hopefully stop the disease, maybe prevent it from progressing, or maybe even seeing if that we can reverse the symptoms of the disease, the progression of the disease. So that's one thing to note as the change as the clinical system. So for example, what we call standards of care, how clinicians, how physicians and nurses are providing care for patients with a disease, as that changes over time, that changes the natural history as well, or expectation of it. So oftentimes some of these studies will last longitudinally, they'll last a long time after when they started, because they want to make sure they're still staying succinct to or in sync with what the current practice is. So you don't want to say, hey, this drug is really having a big effect on patients with this disease, but it actually isn't doing much because our standards of care have changed, because we're better at maybe managing certain symptoms, or we're better at diagnosing things earlier.
Thank you. We have another one around just really how do patients benefit from natural history studies? I think it's clear that it supports the research and the researchers, but why does it matter to us?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So thanks, Marianne, for that. I think the main thing to remember with this is a partnership. A lot of the times when we talk about these rare diseases, in particular, again, NBIA, much of what we understand is based on those patients that have taken it upon themselves to participate in these studies, then have helped our researchers and our clinicians better understand what they're going through, and then similarly helping us define what we need to do in terms of preparing for managing, hopefully, with research for a treatment or even a improving diagnosis for the field as a whole. So you're participating in in either a natural history study or any of these clinical trials directly benefits yourself in that it helps us make sure that we're taking into account all of the types of patients and their struggles and their experiences, so that whenever we're forming decisions, we're only able to make as good of a decision as who we have participating in these trials. So with that in mind, I definitely want to say that it's tough to see sometimes, because I know a lot of the times folks are thinking about, well, but we need something right now. And that's definitely, I think it's a huge part of this. Part of what these natural history studies help us with, though, is in order to be able to provide that option, we need to also still be understanding what's going on right now. So the more that can participate in it, the better that you can get information on it, and the better it will be, hopefully, for your researchers to be able to develop something like a therapy or improve diagnostics.
Wonderful. And you hit on something that's so clear is this, just we're desperate. We're desperate for an
Mhm.
answer, and we want a treatment and a cure for all of these diseases now. And I think you've really helped us understand how important it is to invest in the natural history so we know if these things work or if they're the right treatments. Thank you, Dr. Hogarth, for sharing the NBIA. We do have natural history studies happening out of OHSU right now. So the links have been provided in the chat. If you are not participating as a parent and as a community member, please consider. It's just so important for us. I think another question in here is around just what kind of information is helpful? Is it just the carriers or just those impacted, or is it anyone in the family that would be helpful to have information on?
Yeah, and I think that it's a really great question. I think one of the benefits you're seeing from this conference is the fact that you have a lot of patients as well as a lot of clinicians and researchers available to talk to about this. Because really, what it comes down to at a single disease level, again, our office focuses on the entire kind of big picture, all 7,000 rare diseases. I think when you talk about a single disease, part of this is making sure that your researchers are tapped into your community, and both they have a chance to help answer these questions exactly like you're asking. What types of information family members can provide is essential for a lot of studies. But the key here is making sure that your researchers really are understanding and are hearing your community and being able to address these needs. Because, again, I think you're only as good. So a lot of times when we talk about research from an NIH perspective, you're only as good as the question you're asking, right? If you don't have the right question and you don't have the right information to make that question, the research itself may not be that effective. So part of this as a community is making sure that you are working really closely with your organizations and your providers, your clinicians, and your researchers to make sure that that's all aligned, that the science lines up very well with what the patients need.
Another good question in here. There's so many different kinds of natural history studies, and we recognize, well, maybe we don't. I think parts of our community doesn't recognize how valuable the data is that's associated with each one of our NBIA individuals. So there's a question in here just around the traditional natural history study versus an accelerated approach. Like, how do we know which ones to participate in that are quality and are going to protect our information?
Yeah, and I'm gonna take a step back from that, because I think, a lot of the times as a community, as a patient community, there can be a lot of different research studies occurring that you're not sure exactly how, what that's going to do for for your disease or for your field and ultimately for your community. Part of this is as an organization level. So if a lot of the patient organizations that help the communities really connect to their providers and their researchers, they need to have strong champions from the research side, medical science advisory boards, to help them interpret all of these potential studies that are occurring. And ultimately, the understanding that they then need to translate over to the patient community of, when you're participating in these, how does this help, again, the science move forward and hopefully therapies move forward in your disease. A lot of the work that's happening in terms of research, there are so many different things that could be occurring in some spaces. And in other spaces, again, we're desperate for any type of movement. So really, it depends on the disease. It depends on the community that you have. And a lot of this is where, again, I'll very much kind of emphasize that patient groups and patient organizations, so that the physicians and researchers they work closely with, that they can help answer those direct questions as long as you're able to really have that alignment and that communication coordination. I think that's going to be the key to help decide essentially, like you're saying, what's the best route from the stance of a regulatory agency, such as the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. When they're deciding how do they approve a certain drug for a certain disease, they take this into consideration because sometimes a lot of it is very dependent on that disease. If you only have, again, a very small population for this disease, 30 people, 100 people, that's a very different circumstance than a disease that has hundreds of thousands or millions of patients, because the type of data that you can collect, the type of research you can do is going to be very different because of that. Some diseases may affect primarily children, and a lot of the times with those diseases that affect children, there's only so much you can study for them, or perhaps some diseases might cause a child to pass away early in life. So there's only so much time they get a chance to look at some of the concerns of natural history of that and progression of that disease. So again, there's a lot of dependencies there. Rather than trying to make all that decision, as individually, again, this is where I think patient groups, their scientific medical advisory boards, their champions can really help funnel those decisions to the community better.
Thank you. And we are so fortunate as an organization to have a strong scientific and medical advisory board who helps guide us through this. So thank you for that reminder. We do have time. We have some comments coming through the chat, so please feel free to continue adding questions there if you have any, or we can certainly call on you if you want to raise your virtual hand. Dr. Sid, anything else that you think is important for us, in a world where us as patients and as caregivers are just overwhelmed by option and what we should be doing and desperate to take action? Just any last words of wisdom that you could impart on us?
Yeah, and again, I'll speak both from the angle of again as a physician by training, as an employee of the NIH, as a federal official, but also as a patient that's also a carrier for rare disease. I think a lot of the times there's a lot to balance out there with all these different decisions. I think the first and foremost framework I would always say is focus on yourself first. If you need to be, if you're not plugged in well into care, if you need to make sure that you're accessing the right type of professionals or specialists yourself, that should be your focus. Once you're able to start thinking in addition to that, once you're able to kind of think about the opportunity to participate in clinical trials or research studies like a natural history study, I definitely would emphasize that, because again, we're only able to understand disease as much as we can based on patients like yourselves being willing to help work with our researchers and clinicians to better understand that disease. The more that you can go and look up some of these links that you have, for example, that others had posted in chat from OHSU about their natural history study, or from other natural history studies happening outside of the US, it's really important for you to consider that when you're ready. And I think you're the only one that can decide that, but when you're ready, that's a huge part of both helping yourself, if maybe you as a patient, or if you're a caregiver of your child, or who you're taking care of, as well as helping other patients out. And ultimately, that's what, as a whole, we're stronger together in that way. So, again, take care of yourself first, make sure that you have the connections and resources you need to be able to manage your care. Research is an incredible tool for helping us move towards therapies. So it definitely helps when you're able to consider being able to participate in one of these trials, understanding whether or not it's appropriate and fits for you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all that you do. I know that, you're not directly connected to us at the NBIA Disorders Association, but wow, we're just so grateful for the work that you do at the NIH to help move all rare disease research forward. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, but Dr. Sid did share his email address in his slides. If you'd like to ask him other questions, feel free to reach out directly. But thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Sid, for everything that you do for us.